Welcome back to another Vue.js video, namely episode 4? 4, I guess, yeah, of this series, Learning Vue.js the Hard Way. And what I mean when I say the hard way is that we are learning Vue.js by simply actually reading the manual, page by page, letter by letter. I mean, I'm not actually reading letter by letter, but I'm sort of summarizing and then we're discussing. But we're going through the manual page by page. But I don't actually know JS, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to know it in like immense detail when we're done with this. So welcome back. And if you're new, consider subscribing so that you won't miss the next episode and the upcoming episodes of this series. Anyways, let's get right into it. Last time we talked about conditionals and we talked about loops. This time we are going to talk about handling user input. Right? So we've only talked about displaying data previously. We've only talked about, let's assume that you have some model that models your data, right? Like you have some kind of data representation, or we've talked about it as a view model as well, but we've said that assume that you have this model that looks like this and it contains these values, then this is the way it would be rendered in your template. And this is the stuff that you could do in your template, or these are the things that you could do in a view. But now we are going to talk about, well, what if, or how can the user actually interact with the application and presumably then change the contents of the model or the view model, depending on how you look at it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, right? So the section here in the, still the first page, is handling user input. And what they're saying here is that you have to use the v-on directive, so v-on, to attach event listeners that invoke methods on our Vue instances. By the way, side note, I mean, they're using the word method here, which I think is interesting because they are heavy on mutation. We've talked a bit about mutation and purity in the previous episodes. By the way, please do watch the previous episodes if you haven't watched the previous video episodes. But then again, like if this all makes sense to you, then no worries, just start here. But they're using the word methods rather than function, which I think is interesting because I've been trying to learn myself to use the word function when I refer to something that truly resembles a function in the mathematical sense, in the sense that if you say f of 1, right, like if you apply the function f to 1, and then that should render some particular value, right? So if you say x is equal to f on 1, or f applied to 1, right? If x equals f applied to 1, then they should be equivalent, right? That's the way we use equality in math. We say these two things are the same thing. But usually when we have methods in, for example, object-oriented programming, or when we have methods that mutate, then we don't actually mean equality, right? We mean assignment. So we mean when you say, like, let's say you say f of 1, let's say maybe you say f applied to the number 1 and 10, and maybe that's a randomizer that gives you a random number between 1 and 10, then I would call that a method semantically, because it's not enabling you to talk about equality. So if you say x equals f applied to 1, 10, or I mean first argument 1, second argument 10, and you get a random number back. I mean, if you invoke it once, you might get 5, and if you invoke it another time, you might get 8, right? So we're not talking about equality because it's impure. The function is impure. Anyways, that was a side note, but I just thought it was interesting then that they're actually using the word method rather than function. So I would guess that maybe that's because of this reason. Anyways. So what they're saying is that we have to use the directive v-on to attach event listeners, and these event listeners will invoke methods on our Vue instances. Okay, so let's look at their example before we do anything else, right? So their example here is that they have a div, they have an ID of Ep4, and the reason that they're specifying this ID is that they're rendering their Vue instance using or into this particular element. It's like targeting it based on this ID, and they're doing that by passing the L property, the EL property, to their configuration object that's passed to the instantiation of Vue. And this we talked about in episode 1, right? But then you can see they also, let's look at the data here, right? So then they have some data, and they have a key called message that contains a string that says hello Vue.js. Okay, so that's fine. So in the template, we can see that they're just rendering that message. This we know, this is stuff we've looked at. But then they have this as well. They have another key, which is methods. So we have to assume that methods is a special keyword, right? So L is a special keyword, like EL. Data is a special keyword. And then probably methods is a special keyword. So it seems that the methods are not mixed in with the data, right? They're separating the idea of the data and the idea of the methods. Maybe you could put functions or methods in your data object. I don't know. I guess we will see that further on. I mean, I don't see any reason why you would not be able to do that. But the question, I guess, is whether you can attach them to event listeners. And spontaneously, I don't really see why we wouldn't be able to do that. So hopefully we'll remember to test that out when we test this out now. But it seems then that methods is probably a special keyword that they are using to specify a number of functions, methods, sorry, that you then can invoke. Or let me say more specifically, that you can attach event listeners, or you can construct event listeners using the v-on directive that will invoke the methods that you choose that exist in this methods object of your Vue instance. Or rather, I mean, of the methods object of the configuration object that's passed to your Vue instance. I mean, I'm saying configuration object, or when I say configuration object, I'm referring to this whole thing that I'm highlighting, right? Like the thing that's being passed to the instantiation of Vue. So, and I mean, you can see the method is called reverse message here, and it's clearly then called reverse message here in the template as well. Actually, they have an example here, so let's just click that. We'll click this button here that says reverse message, and you can see that we get the string backwards, right? So this is why they were having this message as well. So we can click that and it just sort of reverses back and forth. And if we look at the implementation of reverse message, what does this do? I mean, the implementation simply says this.message is equal to this.message split on empty string, so it's turning the string into a series of characters into an array, and then they're reversing it, and then they're joining it back on empty string, meaning that they're taking a string, splitting it into a bunch of characters, reversing that array of characters, and then they're turning that array of characters into a string again. So that's probably because like JavaScript doesn't have a reverse method on strings, I guess. Okay, so I guess we should try this out ourselves. Maybe we should check out. Yeah, so I mean, let's read on a bit more, right? They're emphasizing here that, of course, they're not touching the DOM, right? The document object model. So there is no HTML still anywhere, right? There are no sort of create element calls. Like we're not manually creating elements, or we're not sort of manually changing the inner HTML property of some element, or like even targeting some particular element, right? We still have this nice separation of the view, or like the template, and our model. So, but it's now like we have two models, right? It's like we have a model that represents all our data, and then we have another model that represents all our methods. And you can, in our view, you can attach, like you can bind different, let's say, values to values within your model, or like keys within your model, data model, and then you can bind event listeners to your the values in your methods. I forgot the word. What was I saying? Methods model. Sorry, right? I mean, sorry. The separation is you have the view and you have the model, right? But your model is sort of divided into two parts: the data part and the method part. So in your view, you can bind to the data part, and you can bind to the methods part. And when you bind to the methods part, that's because you're working with some kind of something that is interactable with the user, for example. So let's jump into the code. I feel like in order to make sure that I'm not talking too much before we actually look at some code. Sorry, let me make this font a bit bigger. I forgot. Okay. So we have this directory that we've been working with before, and you can see here we have an index.html file and a main.js file. So let's just jump into Vim. We'll check out the index.html file. Sorry, let me turn off wrapping here, text wrapping. Is it like this? Yeah. So this is the HTML file, and let's look at the main.js file, and that's this. I mean, this is the stuff that we've worked with before. Let's go back to the index.html file, and let me open this in a browser. So it's here. Let me make this text a bit bigger as well. And so yeah, this is the stuff that we've been working with from the last screencast. Let's go back to main.js, and you can see here, I mean, the way we've manipulated this data in the previous episodes is by using set timeouts. So that's a bit silly, right? we probably, I mean, we want the user to be able to interact with the data or with our application. So, I mean, here we're sort of in the code, we're hard coding the adding of an orange. I mean, if I refresh the page, you can see we have 3 items in this list of fruits, but then suddenly we're adding another item here. So, I mean, ideally, I guess we would want to do something like this. Let's just save the main.js file. Let's go back to index.html. Let's just try and, I mean, from the information that we have now, let's just try to quickly hack something up and see if we can actually manage to do that. So let's just say that we have an input type, I guess text, and then something like this, right? And then let's say let's call this fruit, right? So I'm adding a like a binding. I can't remember what these are called. Did we even learn what these are called? But we're binding to the element, we're binding to the key fruit in our model, and I'm rendering a text field. I think it's the way you do it in HTML, right? Yeah, so that seems to work, so let's go with that. And then, how do you do, sorry, it's like, I keep jumping between languages and it's difficult to keep track of how to do different things. So I guess this is the way you construct a button, right? So let's say this is a submit button. So let's think about this. Okay, we have the fruit here. We can render that text. So maybe in the main.js, in order to be able to observe that, we need to add a fruit field. I mean, this is probably non-idiomatic, and what I mean with that is that this is probably not the way you should do it. So bear that in mind, right? We're just doing this in order to try to understand, like we're just toying around with it in order to sort of practice what we're reading in the manual, even though it's not necessarily the preferred way of doing it. I mean, and I don't know whether it is, but I'm just assuming that it isn't. So let's say fruit is an empty string to start with, but let's actually, sorry, let's write, what do we have before? Orange. Let's add that as a default just to see if it renders properly. Okay, sorry, so my mistake, of course, index.html back there, and instead of rendering the fruit inside this input tag, of course it should be something like this. It's that the value is equal to fruit. And then of course we should use a v directive, so it's, sorry, v-bind value to, I was about to write orange, but I mean fruit. And then close the input tag, right? Okay, wait, actually, maybe I'm old, and maybe this is the way we do it now. We don't need the closing tag. I don't know. HTML people, maybe this is the correct syntax, right? HTML5, I guess, something like this. Sorry, I always thought it was more sensible to have self-closing, but whatever. I mean, I did not write the spec. So, okay, so that seems to work, right? Let's stick with that. Let's go back to Vue.js and let's look at it. Okay, how did I actually bind a method? Let's do this. Let's first go to main.js and construct the methods. So this is our data object, right? And then we're saying, okay, but that's the data part of our model. But we can also have a methods part of our model, okay? So that's another object, and let's add a method here called, let's say, add fruit function. Actually, we don't know how to take... sorry, I was going to say we don't know how to take data as arguments, but of course we don't necessarily need to do that because we have access to the view, so we can read from the view. No, sorry, I don't mean we have access to the view. I mean we've bound our template to the value under fruit, or to the key fruit, so we should be able to read from that. So let's say add fruit. And then I guess we would want to do something like this. So this here seems, notice how they're saying this.message, right? And this here does not refer to methods, it seems, right? This sort of refers to, in some sense, data, right? But rather it refers to like the view instance, right? In the same sense as that you remember from the last videos, right? Where we inspected, like we said, app, because we've called our app here, if you see on line 1, we've called it, so we can say app.fruits, for example, and then we get access to the fruits data structure here, and with its corresponding getters and setters. So that's probably what this refers to here. And yeah, I mean, clearly this is a good moment to think about the critique that, let's say, object-oriented programming is often receiving, because or like in regards to that, you need to understand the idea of this in order to read a method. And I don't necessarily mean as in that, well, I mean, firstly, of course, when learning object-oriented programming, you need to grasp the idea of this, which is a bit confusing at first. But then also you need to understand what this is referring to in any given context, right? Because the this keyword here essentially depends on where this function is executed in some sense, right? Like you could change what is available to the this keyword. Wait, am I just being... No, that seems correct, right? Please correct me if I'm incorrect here, and please highlight something in the comments if I'm incorrect here. But I was just thinking that maybe this simply refers to... No, of course not, right? I was thinking maybe this simply just refers to the data object here. No. But of course they have to change somehow the context that this refers to, or the essentially the object that this is referring to whenever this function is executed. But I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't... Yeah, it seems right to me. Anyways, okay. So what we want to do, I mean, they did this dot message equals blah blah blah, blah something else, but we want to do something like this dot let's say fruits dot push a new fruit, and let's just push. Let's hard code a fruit, right? Let's say name hard coded, and then amount 1. Let's say, right? Just to make it simple. Okay. So can we execute that? Of course, let's just run this to see that we have no errors. Let me open up the developer console here. Let's make this font size a bit bigger and see if we have any errors. No, so that seems fine, right? So let's go back to Vue. How did they bind? Okay, so they had a button and then they said v on click. So we're jumping back to index.html. Of course, then I didn't have to talk about or admit that I didn't remember how to make a submit button, because they were actually saying, well, you can just use the button tag. So sorry about that. But okay, so we'll change our old submit button for a button element. So we'll say button, and then we say v on, right? We're adding the directive v on, which essentially says that there's something we want to listen to, right? Think about this. I mean, we have v bind, and then we have v on. So v bind is saying there's some data that's coming in, and whenever that data is, or let me put it this way, vbind is this. Vbind is saying that I am observing some particular piece of data, and whenever that observable piece of data changes, I want to update. That's essentially what vbind is doing, right? But then you can bind it to specific things like title, as we're doing here, or value, as we are doing here. But v-on is different, right? V-on is saying I am observing an event, right? A JavaScript event. And that event could be something like a mouse click, right? Or a key press or something like that, I assume. So it's observing a completely different thing if you think about it, right? So vbind, that's observing your data model, right? Your view model, your model. But v-on is observing the there's a better word for this, I can't remember. Is it like the event? It's not the event loop, I'm thinking of something else, but it's like the I don't know, the event chain or something like this. Anyways, whenever there is an event yeah, maybe that's a strange way of saying it. What I simply mean is that it's observing the event that you specify. And so events are then observable. And I mean, I'm expressing this in a sort of observable pattern or observer pattern way. But of course, you could just think about it as events. I mean, observer pattern and events are like essentially the same thing. So we're saying v on, and then we are binding this, or I mean, we are v onning to, or we're listening to something. So they're listening to click, so presumably we should listen to click. So v on click, and then we're saying, okay, well, what is the method that we want to call? The method that we want to call, what did we call this? Was it like save fruit or add fruit? Yeah, add fruit is what we called it. So let's go back to index.html. So on click, we want to add fruit. Notice how I'm not calling the method. I'm just saying add fruit. We're just specifying what the method is, or what the name of the method is. Okay, and what should the button say? Well, it should say add fruit, I guess. Let's just say add. And then we'll close the button tag. Whoops, button, like that. Okay, let's re-render this page and see if we get something. Okay, let me close the console here again. So we have the pre-written message orange, right? Because we've v-bound the value fruit. We've v-bound to the property value and we've bound the property value to our model data. I need to find a better word for this. I don't know. It's like property, maybe I should say. It's like, yeah, we've bound it to the property fruit on our data model. And then we've bound the click attribute. We've bound that using VOn to our method model, I guess, to the property add fruit on our methods model. So when I click add here, presumably we should run the function add fruit. So let's click add. And it did, right? So then we get, like, to the list, it's added 1 piece of hard-coded. That sounds pretty dumb. Anyways, but and of course we should be able to keep clicking this, right? Because it's adding this hard-coded piece of data. Okay, so let's think about this. If we change this orange stuff, I mean, it doesn't change, right? Because, I mean, as you can see, it's writing the hard-coded value. So if we jump over to main.js, we should be able to change hard-coded for, let's think now, we should be able to do this.fruit, right? Because we have access to the model, and the thing that's in this box is the fruit property. So that kind of makes sense, right? So if we save that and run it, it's still rendering orange, right? That's a different part. That's the vbind part. But now we've changed the function that's being called on VOn, what was it? VOn click. Sorry, of course, VOn click. But, and I said change the method, and I meant like change the implementation of the method. We haven't actually changed which method it calls. But okay, so now if we click add, you can see we get 1 piece of orange. And so if I say another pair, I mean, maybe we should put it here then. So pineapple, boy, I can't spell pineapple. Auto spelling. Pineapple. Oh, of course. Sorry. It's not native English speaker. I'm apologizing myself. Or excusing myself? Anyways, let's move on. Okay, so let's do add. Okay, 1 piece of orange. Wait a minute. Pineapple, add. It's still adding orange. Why is this? Let me refresh the page. If I say orange exclamation point, it's still adding orange. That is strange, right? We've bound the value property. Ooh. How interesting. Okay, sorry. So I'm being sort of a moron now, because this is, I'm now assuming two-way binding, which is actually the next section that happens here. So I guess like I could pretend that this was just an intro into saying, aha, and why does this not work? Well, this does not work because we have one-way binding, but if we had two-way binding, this would trivially work. That was not at all my intention, but let's pretend that that's the intention. I think we're going to talk about two-way binding in the next video, but what I want to emphasize is essentially this, that this doesn't work. Actually, I think we'll do it in this video. This doesn't work because the value that we've put into this box is only sort of put into this box once. Whenever we change the value here, we're not actually we are not actually changing the model. Actually, that's evident if we do this. If we go into the console again, you remember we said we could, whoops, I should really have brought up the console instead. Console, you remember we said we can ask for data. Oops. Let's do it this way. We can ask for data dot fruit. Oops. Fruit. Nahoy. Data, sorry, not data, app. App.fruit. Let me clear this. App.fruit. And then you can see we get orange, right? And regardless of how many times I change this, I'm going to get orange when I say app.fruit. Because we've only, let's say, or let me put it this way. When Vue is rendering the template, it's only, no, this is a better way of putting it, sorry. This field is observing the observable property fruit on our data model data, right? It's observing data.fruit. But data.fruit, like, which here shows up as app.fruit, so maybe I should say app.fruit, sorry. That thing doesn't actually ever change. Wait, sorry, the pause for an interesting reflection. Let's just, I'm just wondering, can we access add fruit here? Yeah, we can. Okay, so it's mixing. So I mean, when we're specifying our Vue instance, we're separating data stuff from method stuff, right? Like we're specifying our data model separately from our methods model. But you can see here that the Vue instance sort of mixes them up, or like puts them in the same place. So I guess like if we would use the same method or the same name for both of these, like if we would use the name fruit in a method, that would probably not be a good thing, because we also have a data property called fruit. But anyways, so okay, but back to the real point, right? The real point is that we are not actually changing the underlying model. So in some sense, then we have to read from this text field, and I think in order to not sort of resort to, I mean, let's emphasize what they said here. We're not actually touching the DOM, and that's the really important part. So I don't think I'm actually going to figure out how to do this, and instead we're going to simply use two-way binding that they're suggesting in just a moment. But of course there are ways of doing this that don't touch the DOM and that don't use two-way data binding. And that's probably the way we should use it, because I want to talk about the problems of two-way data binding in just a moment. But what's the thing here? So where was I going? Was it one more thing I wanted to say? Well, okay, to make this work, let's at least do. No, but that's not. Yeah, that's not very good. I mean, what we could do is we could do something like this. Like we could, instead of pushing what we pushed before, we could say, in our implementation of add fruit, we could push this.fruits.push, and then maybe make a copy. Like we could say fruits. Yeah, I mean, we could just make a copy of the first fruit. So sorry, that would not be fruits, but that would be this.fruits. So that should work, right? If we run that, it doesn't matter what we write here, right? But whenever we say add, we are adding a copy of the first fruit. Right? So we could even like maybe do a random fruit and then re-add that. But you can see, I mean, clearly our sort of hooking up of the different pieces work, but reading data from this input field is something we haven't gotten to yet. So let's actually dive forwards in this text here, right? So we were looking at this example, and I mean, from what we've done now, we've sort of surpassed their example as well. We're doing something which is just a tiny bit more complicated. Aha, wait. Oh, sorry, here. Okay, so I was scrolling too fast. So here comes the two-way data binding. So two-way data binding solves exactly this problem that we emphasize now, that the field here, let's go to the HTML index. So we're saying bind this input box, bind this input element, or rather bind the value attribute using vbind of the input element to the property fruit in our data model, right? So that whenever, like, observe it, right? So that whenever the value of fruit changes, update the text here. But that's a one-way binding. It's saying that whenever the data model changes, we want to update this display here. But it doesn't say that we should do the other thing, right? That we should do it the other way. It doesn't say whenever I change the value by actually writing in this box, then change the data model, right? That's a different thing. Let me emphasize this also by, let's do another set timeout. So let's say set timeout, and then we say this.fruit equals pineapple. Yep, and let's say 2000 milliseconds. So let's save that. And notice how we're starting with orange. So when I refresh this, we still have orange. But then after 2000 milliseconds, I should have... interesting, we don't. Oops, I'm sorry, so confusing. I wrote this dot. I of course meant app.fruit, right? Because our Vue instance is placed in the variable app. Sorry. Save that, let's refresh. Okay, we start with orange, but then we change to pineapple, right? And of course, let me refresh this and add a few ones. Then you can see, okay, we can add apple. Oh, okay, sorry, we have the old implementation. Let's go. So okay, let's go to main.js again, and let's change the implementation here to what we had before. Notice, I mean, now we have this implementation, which is this.fruits.push, and then push the first fruit that we already have, right? We're sort of duplicating. Let's remove that instead, and instead go back to the old implementation, namely this.fruits.push, and we're pushing a new fruit, and the name will be this.fruit, and the amount will be hard-coded to 1. Let's say, okay, that was the old implementation that we have. So now if I refresh the page and press add, you see we add oranges. But then after 2000 milliseconds, the text is automatically changed to pineapple. And if I start to add then, we'll add pineapple. And in some sense, of course, remember then that this is completely, the fact that we have this visual display, or this thing displayed in a text box, is completely irrelevant to the fact that that there exists a thing called fruit that we can add, and that it's changing over time. So let me demonstrate that by actually removing this input box, right? I'm removing it, I'm saving, and I'm refreshing. Now we just have an add button, but we can still add orange, and then after a while it turns into pineapple, right? And now forever it will be pineapple. So again, that sort of really emphasizes that we don't have two-way data binding here. And so let's look at two-way data binding. I mean, as you can see from the code example here, it's really what they're saying. I mean, it's a breeze. So here's the key difference, right? We've seen the directive vbind. We've seen the directive sorry, I was like, my phone is freaking out, so I was a bit confused. Sorry, this is why I'm distracted. We've seen the directive vbind. We've seen the directive von. But now we're also seeing the directive vmodel. Okay, so presumably vmodel then is what enables two-way data binding. So it's saying this thing, or I want to bind. Let me put it this way. I want to observe the observable property message of your data model, so that whenever the property message changes in your data model, I want to update the value here. But I might change the value locally here, right? In this input box, somehow I might change that, right? Like some other thing might change that, or like the user might change it because they're typing. And if they do that, I want to update in the other way. So I want to say that then the data model should observe me, right? When I change the thing that I usually observe, the data model should change. So this is also why I haven't said this yet, but two-way data binding is a bit iffy, right? It was kind of my understanding that I thought we had sort of left the world of two-way data binding with, I don't know, Ember.js or something like this, right? So I want to talk briefly about this idea of data down and actions up. So that's an idea that I don't know actually where it came from, but it's been talked about a lot in Ember.js, and it's been talked about a lot in React, especially Redux, I guess. And essentially, I mean, I googled it to try to find some good resource, like some good blog post, and I couldn't really find something that I really appreciated. But maybe this is a good candidate. I haven't read this whole thing, but I read. I mean, here I just thought this was a good statement, right? Or this was a good summary. For a component to be reusable, it should refrain from mutating data that it doesn't own. And when a component's side effects will change from one use case to the next, those side effects should be handled using actions up pattern. So in other words, I mean, what they're saying, think back to this discussion that we had of things that reach deep into other things to change the value of those other things. Like that's sort of in my mind, the essence of two-way data binding. Another way of thinking about this problem is that you're sort of pairing two observables that are observing each other, which is kind of an odd scenario, right? And it's kind of like a recipe for disaster, because it's like the data model is observing the view, or rather, let's start in the other end, because that's the more common scenario, right? Or like that's the one-way data binding that we usually have. So the view is observing the data model, so that whenever the data model changes, the view will change. But then the data model is also observing the view so that whenever the view changes, the data model will change, right? So suddenly you have this sort of, well, I'll change if you change and you change if I change. And it's not like that's an infinite problem. It's more like that at scale, like in trivial scenarios, that's probably not a problem, but that at scale could probably become very tricky to reason about. Another way of thinking about that is like, what if you have chains, right? What if you have chains? So notice how I said that when looking at our code here, or looking at our page, I said that we are now observing, if we do a two-way data binding, we are observing changes in this text box. But in some sense, when we say v model, right, rather than v bind, we're saying that no matter how the value here changes, I want to update myself, right? So even if somebody else is changing this value, I mean, there are many different ways of changing that, right? It's like some other portion of the application could change that, even by sort of like making a hacky call, like what am I saying? Actually change the contents of that element by invoking the JavaScript necessary to change it. So like using inner HTML or something like this. Yeah, I mean, many different ways. And even if it's not an input field, right? It's like, if you have, I'm struggling to come up with a tricky scenario. I guess I would recommend to check out this blog post, for example, and don't necessarily stare yourself blind on this blog post. There are probably many different blog posts if you Google the idea of data down, actions up. While doing this, I actually also realized that there's this project called Vuex. So, I mean, I think Redux is fantastic, and then there's maybe this shouldn't be called Vuex. Vuex? No, Vuex. It has to be okay. Or Vuex, whatever. Vuex. So that's probably a Redux-inspired Vue variant, or like a variant of Vue that sort of have actions and reducers and store and so forth, like concepts from Redux. So it's I guess they're trying to give Vue predictable state management. The reason I'm just emphasizing that is that they are probably bringing this idea of data down and actions up to heart when building that. So what is data down, actions up, right? It's a topic for a different conversation, but like just very shortly, the idea is that data should flow into your views, right? Your model contains a bunch of stuff, like a bunch of data, and that data should feed down into your view. And now we're just thinking about a very simple scenario where it's like you have data and then you have a view. But in a complex application, and I mean not even in a complex application, in a well-architected application, you have components in components, and we'll get to components in like probably the next video. So in some sense then it's like you have some data object that's whose properties are being passed down into a component, or like a series of components. And for every one of those components, they are passing data down, further down into components, or to subcomponents. And they are passing data down, further down into further subcomponents, so that data is sort of flowing down into all of the subcomponents in the view, right? It's like it's this displaying idea, right? It's like passing down all the data that needs to be displayed. But then what is actions up, right? Actions up is saying that instead of saying that you have this view that sort of somehow, let's look at this summary again, that wants to mutate data that isn't its own, right? Like, think about it this way. If I have an input text field and I have a temporary variable called fruit, that's fine. I can mutate it like as much as I want. Who cares, right? But if I start to mutate the fruit property of the root model, right? Let's say there's a fruit property in the root model, and I start to change that wildly, who knows how many other observers there are of that property, right? Suddenly everything starts to change everywhere. And that's not necessarily a good thing, right? So the spin that they're taking in this article, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's this one, that they talk about reusability, right? Right. I mean, as we just read, they're talking about reusability. So that's not very useful, because maybe you don't want to have, they have an example of a color picker, right? Maybe you don't want to have a color picker that changes some particular thing. Maybe you want to have a color picker that just picks a color, right? And then emits that color somehow, and then you can choose to react to this newly emitted color. And that's the other idea, right? That's the idea of actions up. So you push data downwards down through all the components, and you sort of render out all the data. You render out all the components using the data that you have. But then whenever stuff happens in the components, you're passing actions back up. You're emitting data back up, right? Like both of these things are data, but they're different kinds of data. One is like the state of the application, that's the data down. But the data up, the actions up, those are actions. Those are sort of action requests. They're the idea of saying that, well, something has happened and you need to react to this thing. And if, again, like if you've watched my videos on observer patterns, or I mean, if you know observer pattern, then you can think about that as the thing that's being sent out from the observable to the observers, like the piece of data that's being sent out from the observable out to all the observers, the thing that is being broadcasted. And another way of thinking about it is to think of events. Like it's like your components, your pieces of an application are emitting events, and when you're emitting those events, other components, or sorry, not other components. So this depends on the implementation, right? This depends on the implementation of your application, right? And I'm refraining from saying something because I want to see what the idiomatic way in Vue is. But in Redux, I mean, those would be the reducers. So the reducers would react to those events by reducing down the current state of the application, like the current state of your data model, to a different state, right? So it's like if somebody's emitting the message that a new fruit called pineapple has been added, or rather, they're emitting the piece of data, pineapple added, right? Pineapple added. And then your reducer that reduces the list of fruits, the reducer that says, I am the one that controls whether there are new fruits added. That thing will say, okay, if there's a message that was sent out, if there's an event that was sent out that said that there was a fruit that was added and that was called pineapple, then I will add that to my list of fruits. But anyways, let me. So this was a long sidetrack, but hopefully you found that useful, because I think it's very, very important to remember this discussion when going into something like two-way data binding, because again, it's kind of my understanding that we've sort of written off data binding as a too dangerous idea, right? It's like overly simplistic, and the consequences of using it long term are not good, right? But maybe they have a different spin on it, right? Maybe they have a suggestion on how to control it to make it not spin out of control, let's say. Let's finish this up. So let's actually do the two-way data binding. So we use vbind here, but it seems like when I just look at this, it kind of seems like the only thing we have to do is we have to change the bind to model. So we say we have this input text field, and instead of saying that we vbind the property value to the data property fruit, we simply vmodel bind, like we say vmodel the attribute value to the data model property fruit. Let's just try that, because like probably that is actually all we need. So let's jump back here to the page. Let me close this console again, and let's just refresh. So, or actually, sorry, let's open up the console. Apologies. And then let's say, what was it? App.fruit, right? You can see then that we have pineapple. Let me clear this out and print it again. So you can see we have pineapple. But if I now change it, if I add an exclamation point here, we should get an exclamation mark. Yeah. And you can see that. So now we've actually two-way bound, or we've done two-way binding. So if I change back, if I change back from model to bind, and save that and refresh, and clear this, and then just say app.fruit, you can see that we have pineapple. But if I then add this exclamation mark, exclamation point, I don't know, sorry, one of those words, and I say app.fruit again, you can see we still have the old value, right? No matter how much stuff I add here, we still have the old value. So we don't have two-way data binding. We only have one-way data binding. So data is flowing down, but it's not flowing up, right? So when I say that it's not flowing up, by the way, let me just make it super clear that two-way data binding is not the idea of data down, actions up, right? It seems to me that rather data down, actions up is a criticism of the idea of two-way data binding, right? Because two-way data binding is more like we are saying that this field is able to mutate the value of the property fruit of the model, of the data model, right? So that's more like this idea of one thing reaching deeply into another thing in order to change that's value, or to change that thing's value. So yeah, I mean, when you do bind, that doesn't work. But let's in the index.html file, let's jump back to vmodel, and then let's refresh that again. And now let's close the console. Oh, sorry, actually, let's go to main.js because I'm realizing we have this set timeout thing left, or we've left that. So let's remove that so it's not automatically changing from orange to pineapple. So now it's orange and we're rating to milliseconds and it stays orange, right? You can see nothing's changing. But okay, if I now say add with orange, okay, that works. We can add an orange. Can I then add a pineapple? Yeah, we can, right? So now it's two-way bound. So again, think about it. When I'm changing the contents of this box, then what's happening is that the property fruit of our data model is updated. Every time I change it here, right, it's updated. And then when I say add, this has in some sense nothing to do with the input field. Like, and actually, I mean, in most of the senses of the word, it has nothing to do with the text field. What it has something to do with is that that thing is fetching the value of the property fruit on our data model, and then adding that to this list of fruits. And since the contents of this text box is two-way bound to the property fruit in our data model, then in that sense they have a connection, right? So this field here that I'm writing pineapple, so this field is, whenever I'm changing here, is updating the property fruit, and whenever I click add, I'm reading from the property fruit and I'm adding that into the list of fruits in our data model. Okay, now I guess I've been saying way too much for way too long, so I think we're gonna wrap it up here. Let's just make sure in the documentation that we don't have anything more, right? Yeah, I mean, they have this example of two-way data binding here as well, so I mean, if I type here, you can see the text up here is changing. And I mean, it's essentially the same thing that we have, right? They have a p tag here with a message, and then they have an input box that they've vmodel bound to the property message. Yeah. Wait a minute. I'm actually realizing this is interesting. Notice how, last thing, notice how we said vmodel, where's the vmodel? Vmodel :value, but they are actually just saying vmodel. So sorry, we're gonna get to this later on. I think this is from, so I peeked forward a bit in the documentation. Where was this? I think I read form input bindings, and then they said something like that they predict the data type. Yes, so they're saying it automatically picks the correct way to update the element based on the input type. I think that's maybe what we're looking at here, right? So in some sense, because it's not actually just this :value piece that's missing, they actually don't even have type text, but maybe that's because HTML assumes text if I don't put anything else. That's probably it, right? So even if I don't, let's just say if I just had an input field, right? Let's try to render that. Let me go back in the documentation so we're not losing our position in the documentation. And then let's go back to our page and update that, right? Yeah. So the fact that we're getting a text box probably is because if I just specify that we have an input, the browser assumes that that's a text field, and I would guess that that's valid HTML, like spec valid, like valid according to the specification of HTML5, because they have this in the Vue documentation. It would surprise me if they would do something that's not valid here. But if that's not valid, maybe let me know in the comments. That would be, yeah, it's not good. But then, so they say input, and then they say, I mean, if it's not valid, maybe it's not the end of the world, obviously, because HTML is a mess. But if it's not valid, then it might be ambiguous, right? So browsers might interpret it different ways, and I think that's a good reason for sticking, like ensuring that you're always writing valid HTML. Anyways, but then they were saying vmodel only, right? Instead of saying vmodel value. So they're saying vmodel Oh, sorry, now I was about to write message because they have message, but we have fruit. So this should work as well, right? We've omitted colon value. So I can add orange. Can I add pineapple? Let's make sure this works again. Yeah, we can. So maybe, I'd guess, now I'm guessing maybe this directive always assumes value. I don't know. Let's try it out. Let's try it out. We gotta know, right? Let's say, instead, let's do this. Let's say that this is a p tag, right? Let's say it's a p tag. Whoops. And no, but then I can't bind, I have to bind. How am I gonna, yeah, okay. So let's say this, let's say v model on title. This is a bit silly, right? And let's say it's a p tag. So I couldn't really figure out a better attribute to work with. So, okay, sorry, I need to write something here. So foobar, I'm just writing foobar because it doesn't really matter what this text is. So we have this text here, and if I inspect this text, we should be able to see that, no, okay, so P doesn't have, no, actually, I was going to say P doesn't have title, but it's probably because you can't use the model directive on title. So if I say vbind on title, yeah, then we're actually rendering the title. Yeah, okay, so I would guess spontaneously now, hopefully you followed how we're developing a hypothesis, and then we're making a short test in order to prove the hypothesis wrong or true or false. But, or rather, maybe I should say it this way: we had a hypothesis about how the world could be, which was that maybe you can use vbind on any property, on any attribute of an element, or on a tag, but then we found one instance that doesn't work. We found one instance where we can't vbind, so we can't vbind to the attribute title, and hence we're saying that our hypothesis is necessarily wrong because we can't vbind to everything. Or sorry, I said vbind. I meant vmodel. Woof. We can vbind to many things, it seems. This we haven't really thought about, or we haven't really talked about how many different things you can vbind to, or which things you can't vbind to. But we're now proving that you can't vmodel to anything. That's sort of what we tested. But then again, like, so the reason I'm saying that, like, in terms of hypothesis testing, is that we have by no means proven that you can only vmodel bind to value, but I would guess that maybe you actually only can that, right? But we'll see when we go further on. Probably they have a section on two-way data binding, and if nothing else, they have the section on forms, so we'll see that. But it would make sense, right? Because, like, why would you two-way data bind to something else than an input field, whether that input field is a text field or a text area, or a radio button or a check button or anything like that, right? So maybe that's also a way that they're sort of keeping this two-way data binding in check. But I mean, still, like, you can of course obviously still make hairy messes with input boxes, of course, right? You still have this problem of, like, data flowing through to a bunch of different components. Actually, we never talked about this example. Last one, and then I'll cut it. I promise. I'm realizing now we're above 50 minutes. Whew. Okay, so think about it this way. What if you have something like an amount, right? Where it's like, what if you have a field in which there's an amount, and that amount is used in some kind of calculation, right? So whenever you change the field, you're updating the sorry, wait, actually, before I say anything, let's undo backwards to the old HTML so that we're not looking at something that's completely broken. Let's do that, right? That was the thing that worked. Orange. Yeah, okay, that's the thing that works. So let's assume that let's say that you have this text field, right? And this text field somehow, like, takes a number as input, and this number is used in some other calculation. But then maybe there's, like, because, like, it's actually changing something directly on the model because of two-way data binding. Maybe that property is used in tons of different places. And maybe in some place, some aggregate of that calculation computes a new number which has like an not an edge case, but a range of valid values. So let's say that if you suddenly reach 0, let's say, right? Like let's say that the number that we're talking about here is the second number in a division, right? So it's like 100 divided by 5, right? So maybe this number that we put here is the 5. And then if we would put 0 here, you can't divide by 0, and then maybe we would have a potential crash. And this seems like a stupid example, because you're like, but I mean, obviously I wouldn't, I know that I'm able to change this value as a user, or like I know that I'm letting the user change this value, so obviously I wouldn't use it in a calculation that could throw an error, because I wouldn't divide by it. But again, because we're changing a property on the model, you don't know who else is using that property. And especially like if you have a huge application, right? Of course, like it's to be expected that that thing is used elsewhere. So yeah, of course. I mean, and that's one example of how things could go not necessarily horribly wrong. I mean, the point is not like that the crash would be catastrophic, but the point is that finding that error might actually be very tricky. And if you didn't have two-way data binding, finding that error would probably be significantly easier. Like finding the root cause of that error. I was going actually to say one thing about data down, actions up. What was that? I just thought about it now when I said. And the numbers, yeah, so actually, okay, sorry, this time one last thing. Moving, so in some sense, if your component is hard coding what it does, right? Like if the button is hard coding what it does when something happens, then that's sort of the worst scenario. Like if the add fruit method is inlined within this button, right? Then it's totally unchangeable. It's totally unreusable. However, if we pass in a method, that's a step better, right? Then we are calling the method add fruit, and we can re-render. I mean, if you think about buttons as a component, we'll talk about this when we get into components. You can change them. You can call remove fruit and then say remove. And the button template, the button component, right? We haven't talked about components yet, but like the idea of a button is agnostic to the idea of what happens when you click its button, right? When you click it. So that's a level above, right? Like that's better. And then potentially, maybe now I'm on sort of icy territory, but maybe it would then even be better to, instead of calling a method that actually directly changes something, maybe dispatching a action, again back to the data down actions up, that could be consumed by other listeners, right? So it's you're emitting an action that could be caught, like could be acted upon or consumed by other parts of the system that would then change something in the model, right? Instead of just passing in something directly here. So I'm thinking of that sort of as 3 layers, but a bit shady. Maybe I'm wrong here. Anyways, let's now wrap this up. This turned into a super long episode. Let me know if you think this was too long or if this is working, and let me know if you think the discussions were interesting or not. Thanks a ton for sticking with this series. I hope you're learning Vue, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. Remember to subscribe so that you won't miss the next episode. Feel free to recommend this series to a friend if you think they'll like it. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.